무엇이 한 표를 결정할까요? 나의 신념? 경제적 요인? 아니면 후보자의 가치관이 옳아서? 개인의 정치적 행동을 집단 간 관계의 관점에서 연구해온 정치 심리학자 레오니 허디는 이렇게 답합니다.
They have group identities that may be based on race or ethnicity or religion or their region of country, and that they're motivated to defend these social groups. And they can translate this into political preferences.
그녀의 강의 핵심은 이겁니다. 나의 민주주의는 진짜인가? 그동안 신념이라고 생각했던 것들이 의심으로 바뀔지도 모르겠네요.
Welcome to EBS. We Daehan Sue Up Great Minds. My name is Leonie Huddy, and I'm a distinguished professor of political science at Stony Brook University in New York. In this lecture, I'm going to talk about political psychology. It's my field, and it's an important topic because we bring an understanding of psychology to bear on an understanding of ordinary people's political attitudes. So when we talk about political psychology, what we're doing is applying what we know about human behavior, about human nature, to an understanding of people's political attitudes and behavior. And what's important here is to understand that people operate in politics within a political context. So our understanding of their behavior varies somewhat with the type of democracy that they live in, the type of institutions that they face, and what's happening at any point in time in a society. But that human psychology helps us to understand their reactions to what's going on in their political context. So let me say a little bit about what we expect. When we talk about democracy, and here I'm going to be largely focusing on people, publics, who live in democratic systems. They are supposed to be well-informed. They're supposed to understand these policy positions. They're supposed to do some research, gain information, and become fully informed on the issues of the day. And this is where we believe, when we apply psychology to this, that that is an unrealistic set of assumptions. We really cannot expect people to spend an enormous amount of time investigating all of their potential elected officials, learning about all of the issues, and doing a lot of research. It's simply not the way things happen. So what we're going to do is take a deeper dive into how humans work, how they gain information, and what some of the quirks are in our human information system of processing information, to understand what actually happens and not what happens ideally. And I think this really helps us to understand some of the issues that we're facing in democratic systems today and why we end up criticizing the public for falling short on its duty. One of the assumptions of democratic theory and a rational approach to democracy is that I have a self-interest and that I'm going to research these candidates, I'm going to understand their policies, and I'm going to ask, is that good for me? But it's complicated and that's difficult. Oftentimes people are presented with a grid. If we were to do our rational democratic job, what we would do is we'd perhaps make an Excel spreadsheet. We'd put all the candidates across, and then we'd run down all of the different issues that the candidates were talking about. We'd become fully informed on their positions, and we'd ask ourselves, where do I stand? Is this good for me? And I would add it all up, and at the end say, that's the best candidate. Again, this is not how people approach politics, but that is the democratic ideal. That is what we're supposed to be doing, even if we don't do that. Right now, the United States is facing an election, the 2024 presidential election, and even then, we're fairly sure that people have not investigated the candidates fully in terms of all the different policy options that they're presenting. It's just simply unrealistic. So what is wrong with this picture of a fully rational human who is trying or supposed to really dig into this information and become fully informed about the candidates? We have several problems, several key problems. One is, are humans really capable of doing this? There are limits to our information processing system, And those help us understand why it is so difficult for someone to acquire all of the information that they're supposed to have when they face candidates in an election. So let me dig in a little bit to this question of human ability and what we're like as information processors. What is our cognitive system really like? One of the first issues is that we really need to focus in on things to absorb information. We have an unlimited ability to remember things. To get things into your long-term memory, you really need to pay attention closely to the information itself, focus on it in order for you to be able to remember it. This is a problem in a complicated environment where the news is passing you by and you're not actually studying it. Maybe it's happening in the background, but you don't have the attentional focus to dig in and really acquire the information that you need. So that's one of the limitations of humans as information processors. We really need to focus. The second thing that we say about humans as information processors is that we are cognitive misers. In other words, we expend our effort on learning and information processing very carefully. Is often people don't have a lot of political information. It's a bit shocking in the US when we ask these questions. Even someone as prominent as the vice president is not widely known by everyone. In a recent 2023 poll, only 70% of Americans could name Kamala Harris as the vice president. Now, that would be higher today since she became the presidential candidate for the Democratic Party. In this recent poll, only about 44% of Americans could say how long a senator in the upper house of the US Congress could stand for election. How long were they elected for? And we can go on with different facts like this, that people, even though they're making decisions in an election, are often not well informed about what's happening in politics. So again, this is a problem for a model that assumes that our democratic public is fully informed and making these fully informed decisions. A third point is about our use of heuristics. So we're still talking about our ability to acquire the information that we need to make good political judgments. But instead of obtaining all of the information we need, we typically use some shortcut rules to decide. And one of the most common rules that's used, certainly in the US democracy, is which political party is the person from? Are they a Democrat or are they a Republican? And that may be more than enough information for someone. They don't need to know their policy positions. In fact, they may not care about them. That's the one piece of information. That's a pretty easy rule to use. And again, it challenges this idea that we're learning all about the candidates and all about the policy issues. When we talk about these heuristics, I've mentioned partisanship, but there are other heuristics as well. So sometimes, and we're discussing this a lot in the current election, could celebrities play a role? When we're looking at some of the younger voters, sometimes social media influencers or entertainers are taking a stance on who to vote for in an election. And that may be enough for some people. Again, it's a cue. They may take it. It's a heuristic. And again, it doesn't really require knowing anything about the stance of the candidates on the issues of the day. Physical attractiveness could be another. So these shortcuts are very widely used in politics, and people use them to cut through all of the information, which is very effortful to acquire. We sometimes are also influenced by things that are outside of our conscious awareness. Sometimes candidates run short political ads that are very emotional.
I will fight for you with every breath, and I will never let you down. I'm gonna fight like a G, they all gon' see.
Trump is literally putting his life on the line, and he's willing to risk it all.
He is strong. He is fearless.
We believe in each other. We believe in our country. We're not falling for these folks who are trying to divide us. Together, we'll build a brighter future for our nation, where we stand for freedom.
We're not really processing the information all that carefully because it's going by very quickly, but we can be influenced by the emotional tone or maybe the images that are shown to us in these political ads without really being fully aware of it. So again, this is something that's outside of our rational awareness that can influence our political judgments. Another thing, and this also I should add, adds to sometimes we're applying heuristics that are incorrect. So we may use stereotypes. We may decide, for example, that without really thinking about it, we're applying a stereotype about men and women. That when we see a female political candidate, we make decisions about her without really knowing her, that perhaps she won't be as strong on foreign policy or as decisive as a male leader. Again, this is outside of the information that you might have about the person. It's a stereotype or a shortcut or a judgment that you're making about them without that information. And the last point is about people being defensive when they process information. Often we're trying to protect a point of view that we have, and so we don't deal with new information even-handedly. We'll argue against information that we don't like, maybe information that's coming from an opposing political party or candidate. So that can also distort our understanding of the policy stances that the candidates are offering to the public, and affects our ability to rationally process all of this information about the candidates in an election. The second piece of this that we were discussing that is challenging for people is the motivation. Do citizens in a democratic country have the motivation to do the research that's required to learn about their candidates running for office? The truth is, people are not all that motivated. Some might be, but many are not, to get all of this information, to spend the time and the energy researching their candidates and coming up with that spreadsheet of all the different candidates and where they stand on the issues. And what we look at when we look at motivation, we find that a lot of people are not super interested in politics. It varies over the course of an election. People's interest can increase. But for example, early on, let's say in April of a US election, which is some months, 5 months before the election, 50 to 60% of people will say they're following. They're not really all that interested, even though the campaign is underway. But that leaves about 40 to 50% of people who are not paying attention. Perhaps by the end of the election, 70% of people are saying that they're paying attention, but that still leaves 30% of people who are not. They're simply not paying any attention, may not know the candidates, may not know what's going on. So this is an indication of motivation, that some people are simply not interested in politics. People are distracted, they're focused on other things, busy with social media, they don't have time for it, and they're not really interested in acquiring the information. This unfortunately leads also to political misconceptions. So if we are poorly informed in this way, it also means that we can be misinformed. People have studied this and found, and we're seeing this, I think, increasingly in elections over time, that perhaps we're on social media, we're fed some information that's thoroughly incorrect, but we believe it. And so this, again, is a deviation from what we expect of democratic citizens who are supposed to be doing their job and getting to the bottom of what's happening in an election. So there are some very common misconceptions. People have studied these. Perhaps some of the worst arose during COVID, when many people, for example, did not actually get vaccinated, thought that the vaccines were harmful. Another motivational issue that we need to discuss is the assumption that people will try to make political decisions based on what's good for them. This, again, has been a bedrock principle in understanding how democracy works, but it turns out that people do not think about their self-interest. I know this is very shocking because often journalists, the news media will tell us, oh, well, these people are voting this way because of economics, because it's good for them in terms of their income. But there is so much research showing us that that is not how people make their political decisions. There's been an intense investigation into things like, for example, if I'm unemployed, would I support more unemployment benefits for people who are unemployed? The answer is no. If I think, for example, that I'm going to be a recipient of some other kind of social welfare program, perhaps I will support a candidate who's proposing that. But only in the most extreme cases does that translate into support for that position. Frequently, people have other reasons for making political decisions. It isn't about what's good for me. It's more about what I value, perhaps what group I belong to. So I should mention defensive motivated reasoning here. This is what happens when people don't handle information in an unbiased fashion. This, again, is a motivation that it isn't the motivation to be accurate about politics. It's the motivation to defend what I already believe and possibly defend my political party. So that when I'm processing this information, I'm really doing it in a biased, defensive way. And we've already touched on that, but it's a very powerful factor in politics, so that if the opposing candidate says, I'm going to give you so much money, or I'm going to do this thing at the border, I'm going to stop immigrants from coming in, if I don't like that candidate, I'll tend to distort what they're telling me. I'll say, I don't like their position. This is not good. And so we have this defensive approach to processing information that, again, moves us away from a fully accurate processing of the options that candidates are giving us. And again, we can look at something like COVID and think about the way in which people processed information there. In that situation, Republicans and Democrats were motivated to accept or reject accurate information about COVID based on their political partisanship. So, for example, fewer than 20% of Democrats, but almost a half of Republicans think that vaccines created thousands of deaths. So there's quite a difference based on which party we belong to in terms of processing factual information, and that our partisanship can distort what we believe, even when we're exposed to factual information about what actually happened.